Welcome to everybody. My name is Kim Hutchings. I'm a professor of politics and international relations at Queen Mary University of London. And you're all extremely welcome to this event, Rethinking US Politics in Memory of the Life and Work of Daniel Kato, a good friend and colleague to many of us here. Just a quick reminder, the usual things with a Zoom event, please could you keep yourselves muted unless and until you actually are scheduled to speak in the case of the speakers, or wish to speak at the point at which we go to the audience for any audience contributions. We've got a fantastic panel of people here, people who've known Daniel and his work over a long period of time. They're going to be speaking in a certain order, starting off with Carlos Yescas, a very good friend of Daniel's, who's going to talk to us about his life and their friendship. We then have Professor Ira Katznelson, who will be talking about Daniel's work on liberalizing lynching, which many of you will be familiar with. Then Professor Aziz Rana from Cornell University will speak about Daniel's work in terms of its contribution to constitutional legal scholarship. Then Professor David Plotke from the New School will be talking about what was Daniel's most recent project, his book proposal on the politics that racism makes. We'll then move to Professor Eileen Topol, who will be talking about the ways in which Daniel found his way into the entrance into explaining the persistence of racism within the US. And then Ian Zuckerman is going to speak. And finally, no, not quite finally, then we have, Professor Ian Zuckerman, then Professor Alex Gourevitch, and finally, Dr. Katherine Hall, who will be speaking on a variety of aspects of work that they've been doing with Daniel, or in Kate's case on teaching that she has taken over from Daniel in developing his module at Queen Mary. The format of the session is that each of the speakers will take up to around about 10 minutes to say their piece about Daniel, and then we will open it up to a discussion, comments or tributes from the audience. Just before I hand over to the first speaker, and I'm noting that there's comments in chat, please do feel free to put your comments and questions in chat. But just before I hand over to the first speaker, I wanted to read you a message from a colleague of mine and of Daniel's, Robbie Shilliam, which he sent to me because he wasn't able to be here. And I just wanted to read it out to you. I think it gives a really good flavor of what Daniel was like. So this is from Robbie Shilliam, who's now based at Johns Hopkins University, but was a colleague here at Queen Mary and worked with Daniel during that time. He's talking about the two of them. We laughed at the different mores of UK and US academia. He was, I think, significantly disoriented by the lack of faculty autonomy in the UK. And I think it was taking him a little time to reorient, especially in terms of his students. But in every conversation we had on these issues, Dan's ethical duty to teach critically was foremost. We also laughed at the different, if imbricated, constellations of race on this and that side of the Atlantic. Above all, he wished to cultivate a critical and salient positionality for himself, with all due attention taken to his American difference. It seemed to me that his guiding mantra was, do no harm. I distinctly remember a research seminar he gave to the department, which was a dizzying multi-chapter mega epic appraisal of race politics in the US. He got, as you might expect, and this is an in-joke for our Queen Mary department, a few historical materialist questions about capitalism. A few days later, he reflected on the experience to me, saying something along the lines of, well, I suppose we all have different takes and perspectives. I don't think it was in any way a criticism of historical materialism. Rather, as far as I could tell, it was a commitment to plurality of thought amongst friends. That commitment stuck with me and has only become more salient as the last few years have passed. I'm sorry I couldn't make it in Zoom in person, But I remember Dan, and it's comforting to think that our intellectual lives are greater than the sum of the words that we write. So that was just a tribute from Robbie Shillian, who unfortunately couldn't be here this evening or morning or afternoon for some of you. Okay, so without more ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. So Carlos Yescas, if you'd like to take it away.
Thank you, Kim. Hello from New England. I'm going to read my remarks. Good morning. Thank you all for attending this virtual conference. Thank you, Professor Hutchings, for organizing us, and to the QMUL community for opening the space to celebrate the work and life of my dear friend, Daniel Kato. I was also asked to give these remarks today on behalf of Daniel's family in California, Chizuko, Nancy, Chris, and Amanda. They are incredibly touched by your love for him and thank everyone who is keeping his memory alive. I also want to recognize Katie, who shared the last 2 years of Daniel's life. Her love for him gave Daniel a new sense of purpose. Dot, Christina, Romero, Sarah and Jorge, Georgina and Jessica, Linnell, Will, and his other friends in England, the US, Mexico, Europe, and elsewhere. I know how much Daniel loved you and how sorry he will be to make you sad with his passing. You will hear today from Daniel's advisors on his work on lynching, and from Eileen about his new research, and from Ian and others about projects he was working on with colleagues, Vicky, David, and Ira. He held you all in high regard and always wanted to follow in your footsteps. Before moving on, let me tell you some things about Daniel. He was the type of friend and colleague who could be incredibly frank and honest, but always happy to help and follow up. He kept in touch with many of us on a regular basis, checking in and making sure we were heard. He would listen and ask how we were doing. The Thursday before his accident, we spoke for about 2 hours. He told me about the research he had conducted in Washington for his new project and said he will be sending the final draft after Eileen was done reviewing it. We also talked about his family, especially his mom's health, about his visit to my sister and her wife in Mexico, his relationship with Katie, and our possible move to England. He is in large part the reason that my husband got a job at Newcastle University. The final SMS message we wrote to each other were on the topic of our shared love of Keanu Reeves. This, I believe, was the kind of person that he was with many of his friends in academia and beyond. Conversations with him went from intense debates on liberalism and the role of the political theorist in society to mundane conversations about podcasts to listen to. He had immense love for America, the country, not only its institutions and culture, but also all of its flaws. And his work was always a quest to make the country better for people like us. Marked by his mother's history of growing up in a Japanese internment camp in California, and his own experience living through the 1992 LA riots and a backlash against affirmative action in the California system, Daniel's work and convictions always demanded greater social justice. He found in community and labor organizing a space to fight for his ideals. While in college, he was active in the Cross-Cultural Center, where he built a close group of friends who remember him fondly. His friend Alex, with us today, shared the recordings of a Zoom meeting his San Diego peers had to mark 1 year of his passing last November. Listening to his friends from that time, I learned about Daniel's constant questioning of the systems of power, including colonialism and masculinity, and the role of people of color in feminist activism. Seeing him in those pictures they posted before we met confirmed that Daniel always had a regular resting smile and a smile. He loved from his gut and was not afraid of being happy in the moment. However, he often wondered in private what happiness looked like for other folks. This empathy was rooted in a belief of self-care, which he explored becoming a certified masseuse. A day with him could involve going to the spa, drinking too much, singing karaoke, or working on an essay. He made it seem easy to balance a rigorous academic life and a brutal and a full social life. Still, trying to keep the balance was not always easy, and he often got frustrated with his own work and relationships. In those moments, he would disappear only to return full of energy and ready to re-engage. When his book was awarded the Charles Taylor Book Award in 2016, he insisted that his best friend Jorge Romero and I join him in Philadelphia. When we got to the room where the ceremony was going to be held, the event could not start because Daniel was chatting with colleagues and friends, catching up about their work and achievements. I met him as a student advisor at the new school. He was not great at navigating school bureaucracy, but he made it up by being a great listener. He encouraged students to take classes outside of their comfort zone and the discipline. This is why he felt so at home in the interdisciplinary environment of the new school. While his work centered around racial and ethnic studies and APD, his interests were truly intersectional. He was often afraid of reading too narrowly within the discipline of politics and constantly asked people about the latest books they had read. He was also eclectic in his music taste, as his friend Jennifer could attest. He was also an excellent salsa dancer. He met his ex-wife Lindsay through their salsa teacher in Michigan. In Kalamazoo, like at QMUL, he joined students and faculty to demand better working conditions and was active in union organizing. He felt uncomfortable in front of a microphone and TV cameras, but was a natural leading group discussion. His students often complain about his lecturing style, but praise him for his activism and fashion choices. He often wore bright red Converse sneakers. Over the past year and a half, his friends from New York have been sharing images and messages online. We often wonder what his reading of the current political moment would be, how we needed him to make sense of so many things happening in the US that involve Congress, the presidency, and about the success of the Black Lives Matter movement to start reframing the conversation in the US and hopefully in England. We miss you, Daniel. Many of us are left without someone to talk to regularly. Thank you for showing us what it's like to have a listening ear. I hope that I have learned this from you and have become a better listener because of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That's a wonderful tribute. Our next speaker is Professor Ira Katznelson from Columbia University, so I'll turn over to him now.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, and thanks for all who organized this event. And it's, I'm honored to be here with so many dear colleagues and friends. I thought, Carlos, that I knew Daniel reasonably well, at least notwithstanding a significant age difference and teacher-student relation, but I had no idea about the salsa, which somehow fits very well this this truly uncommon, wonderful person. You know, the shock of the email I received in November 2019 is still visceral. I heard from Robert Kostreva, vice dean at the new school, the institution that helped nourish Daniel and that he, as Carlos said, admired and flourished in so well. And that moment still evokes a deep sadness. This is a premature loss of remarkably premature loss of a person so warm, so talented, so committed to the public good that frankly it continues to evoke distressing disbelief. Daniel was an original. There was nothing cookie cutter about him. I've taught long enough to have had many wonderful students, including some colleagues right here. But he was amongst the most, as I said, original. Now, I once taught at the New School, a great experience for me, where Daniel earned his PhD. But I had been at Columbia for a decade and a half when, some 15 years ago, Daniel asked me if he could attend, as I think did Ian, my seminar on American political development. And this was under the terms of a consortium agreement for doctoral students among New York City's research universities. And Daniel did that for 2 years. He introduced himself as a University of California, San Diego graduate and BA graduate in ethnic studies and psychology, interested in the conjunction of US history and social theory. I have to confess that as someone who spent a year of my life as an undergraduate, quote, majoring, the Brits would say reading, psychology, I had an innate skepticism. But Daniel, I quickly overcame it as soon as I got to have even my first conversation with him. But little did I know at the time when he first attended that seminar that soft-spoken, modest person would produce such compelling, formative, original, significant work, and in both the American and British senses of the word, genuinely brilliant work. I'm honored to say that Daniel was my student. Together with 3 faculty at the New School, Vicky Patton, Andreas Kalibas, and Andrew Arado, I served as a member of his dissertation committee, and David Plotke here today was formative in shaping Daniel's superb work. And of course, I had the pleasure of interacting across 2 academic years with Daniel over many weeks when he attended the seminar, and in numerous one-on-one conversations. He would write me an email and would say, a request, and could we meet? And it was always with a draft of a chapter attached. He worked, there was a quiet passion involved in the production of knowledge for Daniel. But as in the case of the best students, Daniel became my teacher. I learned so much from him as his Liberalizing Lynching thesis and book took shape. Now, searching old files, I found two documents written by Daniel, one in 2005 and one in 2006. The 2005 was the first moment he was in the class when he wrote a review, an analytical review of a book called The Slave-Holding Republic by Don Fehrenbacher, a historian at Stanford who by then was no longer alive. And that book that dealt with the antebellum republic, and it's a book, and the writing of Daniel about that book heralded the central question he could not let go of. How could a liberal political tradition devoted to individual and collective rights, devoted to government by consent, devoted to political representation, and above all, devoted to the rule of law, how could such a system go hand in hand with the country's massive system, then for antebellum period, of chattel racial slavery? What does it mean, he already was asking, to have a racialized liberal state? And then I discovered what may be the first written version of what became his work on lynching, This is a document of March 2006 called Liberalism, Lynching, and Constitutional Anarchy. It's all of 3 pages typed. I'll just read 2 paragraphs because you will see that by reading these paragraphs, I will have summarized the central thrust of his work. It says, hypothesis. And for those of you who know how skeptical Daniel was of mainstream political science, the fact that he put down the word hypothesis : must have been an act of pain for him, which he thought must be necessary when he moved from the new school to a class at Columbia University. He wrote, hypothesis. I argue that the particular political configuration was one of constitutional anarchy. Constitutional anarchy refers to a particular constitutional configuration that enabled a normative state, i.e. the rule of law, to create a semi-autonomous, localized, or anomalous zone. Abstracting from Ernst Frankel's model of the dual state and Gerald Newman's conception of anomalous zones, I intend to demonstrate that the US during the period between 1883 and 1938 carved out a legally bounded region of lawlessness. And just 2 more sentences. To be clear, I am not providing a causal explanation for lynching. Rather, my goal is to provide a framework for understanding how a constitutional regime reconciled itself with lynching. Constitutional anarchy serves 2 functions. 1, as a term to describe the ensemble of decisions made by the federal government to accommodate Southern redemption. And 2, a theoretical framework that incorporates a state of exception within public law. And finally, let me close by making 2 observations. First, this work's importance exists simply for the subject, first of all, he grappled with, the obviously. But second, if we put it in a slightly larger frame, he grappled in a wholly novel way for students of the United States with a central puzzle, the puzzle of liberalism and racism. And there are a variety of different moves in the literature. One move, which he respected, as do I, but implicitly disagreed with, Roger Smith, who says there's a liberal tradition and a racial tradition, and they're separate. Not exactly, said Daniel. Or there are deep critics of liberalism who say, look at the history of liberalism and colonialism, imperialism, various forms of oppression, including slavery and Jim Crow, and they say liberalism is the cause. And that's not exactly how Daniel would put it. What he wanted to reveal was how the rule of law and liberal orientations can, under specific conditions, create space for civil society ugliness or for sub-level governments to find space to carry out policies inimical to the core values of liberal democracy. It is about the vulnerabilities of liberalism, which are inherent, and therefore we need to be self-conscious about. And finally, a word of privilege. I was moved in the acknowledgments of his book in which he said that I helped give him language. And I tried to think about what that could mean. And I think it has to do with the word already uttered, imbricate. Because I told Daniel, as I may have told others here, that I love that word because it's a technical word that I learned once from a roofer. When you put a roof on a house, tiles can either be valvated or imbricated. Valvated tiles sit side by side. Imbricated tiles overlap. And what Daniel's work is all about, this brilliant work is all about, is the imbrication of liberalism and racism under determinate conditions in the American experience. And that work, that inspiration, not only is profound, but will last. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ira. And thanks for that word imbrication, which I think was also in Robbie's message. So that's quite an interesting thematic connection there. We'll move on now to Professor Aziz Rana from Cornell University. Aziz.
Well, first, just like what others have said, I wanted to thank Kimberly and everybody else who's involved in organizing this event, that I'm really honored to be included and to have the opportunity to take part. So I met Dan, I think at the very first conference that either of us actually presented a paper at. And I'm pretty sure it was organized by Alex at Columbia, but it was definitely the first time I ever presented a paper. We're both on panel together. And what I remember being really struck by then, and was basically, continuous through the entire time that I knew Daniel, so for the next 15 plus years, was his absolute singularity of vision. The fact that he really had a unique intellectual and academic voice. I mean, this is something I think that Ira was just emphasizing, that there's a way that going to graduate school and then getting training into this profession can be really professionalizing. And so it's actually pretty unusual to meet somebody that has a perspective that is truly their own and distinctive and seems, in a sense, unwavering. And that's one of the things that I felt was really notable about Daniel. And it came across in a couple different ways. So the first way it came across to me was real generosity in how he interacted with his friends and colleagues. And, I experienced this firsthand, that when you're a graduate student, you don't have a lot of self-confidence in what you're writing, and you're getting a ton of feedback, from all directions, including criticism that's constructive. And one of the things that Daniel really had a habit of doing, and that made a big difference for me, is that if he felt that you were on the right track, he was absolutely dogged in voicing his support and enthusiasm for the work, regardless of what other people were saying, even in the room. And that made a big difference when I was finishing my dissertation, when I was turning, my own dissertation into a book and trying to get stuff out the door, that he focused on what was right in the project. And then, further on down the line, he would do things that are actually shouldn't be unusual, but really feel unusual in the field, which is, if he liked your work, he would tell you about it. He'd reach out to you. If he would cite you, he'd teach material that you're writing. He would incorporate friends and colleagues into the conversations that he was having. And, that made a big difference for me when I was starting out. And I feel like it was really uniquely distinctive to how he interacted with others. And the other way that I think his commitment to his own independent voice, really shone through, is with the creativity, the absolute intellectual creativity of his work, which again, this is something that Ira was just talking about, and that I'd like to discuss a little bit in connection to Liberalizing Lynching. Liberalizing Lynching now is an award-winning book. It won a major prize, the Charles Taylor Prize that Carlos has already mentioned. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's a classic in the field of race, racial violence, and American legal and political development, that anybody that I interact with, graduate students or others that wants to write on this topic, I'm like, well, you have to read Daniel's book. But it's worth underscoring that a decade ago, and really, a decade plus. So I read a note from, what was it, like 2006, 2005, that this was a really unusual topic. If in political science, certainly in the study of the law, in the American Academy, there just weren't that many people that were focused on the question of racial violence. Now today, it seems like, well, this is a self-evident topic given the politics of the last half decade. And in that way, really, truly, Daniel was way ahead of his time, because he was focused on a subject matter that just wasn't covered. And it certainly wasn't something that you'd assume a graduate student would have as their central defining question when they were putting together a dissertation. And then, just to further underscore it, The idea that he would take concepts adapted from the study of Nazi Germany, in particular here, this is Ernst Frankel's idea of the dual state, to make sense of enduring questions in American state formation and political development, was also itself, totally distinctive and not at all what you'd expect from someone that was studying even questions of race in the American Legal or Political Science Academy. Again, today, there are more people that have written about the relationship between Nazi Germany and the United States. It's less uncommon. There's a kind of mainstreaming of the language of white supremacy, settler colonialism, and so a number of these kinds of comparative links are more familiar. But I just want to emphasize that in 2005, 2006, this would have been running way against the general grain, against the grain of how these topics were studied. And I think, for that reason, that distinctiveness is why I feel like that the book, Liberalizing Lynching, and his work on racial violence really makes a series of major contributions to the study of American law that in a sense might not, really have fully been grappled with or addressed even in the contemporary literature. Now, Ira did a great job of just giving a framing for what the book argues. So I'm not going to rehash the central thesis of the book, but I'll just emphasize the idea that lynching in particular and the persistence, the structural persistence of racial violence in the US through this idea of constitutional anarchy. That what American law does is it constructs what you can think of as the accepted frame of American constitutionalism as committed to liberal legality, principles of the rule of law, process, constraint, while at the same time maintaining anomalous zones or sites of anarchy that are themselves grounded in lawlessness. And moreover, his idea about constitutional anarchy is itself tied to this notion of racial emergency, which is that there's a persistent way in American life of thinking of the problem of race. And this is the thought that since the baseline of American law and institutions is liberal, it's committed to principles of equality, basic respect for rights. This means that, the problem that you might think of as race is something that kind of erupts temporally at very particular moments. So it's a problem that emerges during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, or during, let's say, the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And it creates the need to maybe pursue particular kinds of dramatic actions. But by and large, the general structure is one that respects legality. And this idea of racial emergency fits because it means that legal and political actors allow racial violence to persist like lynching because they say, well, the basic system of federalism is one that's more or less consistent with liberalism. There's a need to show deference. And so it's permissive toward racial violence, while at the same time saying, if truly we're in an emergency, then we can take extreme action. So the federal government can claim to be liberal while at the same time allowing violence to continue. And this argument, I think, has a bunch of implications for thinking about American law. So the first is, I basically, when I teach 1L con law to first-year law students, I use his invocation of racial emergency and constitutional anarchy as a central way of framing my conversation. And you can see this across a number of cases. So even when I teach a case like Shelby County, which is about voting rights and the Voting Rights Act, where the court basically says that portions of the Voting Rights Act should be struck down because they diverge from kind of a standard respect for states' rights and federalism. I essentially teach this as an embodiment of racial emergency thinking. What the court is saying is that these are normal times, race is not a persistent problem, and so whatever might have been necessary in 1965 is not necessary today. And Cato's approach, Dan's approach, is a really clear way, basically, to make sense of and for students to understand an embedded problem in how American law approaches race, which is refusing to see it as a structural issue, seeing it as something that is just a matter of a kind of exceptional divergence from how law generally operates. Another thing that's really key about his work here, just think of the capital insurrection, mob action that took place a couple weeks ago. One of the things that Dan was really grappling with in Liberalizing Lynching is how is it that white supremacists, those in the KKK, could think of themselves as constitutionalist while engaging in violent mob action, in basically the extrajudicial killing of African Americans. And in a way, that's a problem that you see to this day. So folks that engaged in the mob insurrection, Capitol, were saying that they were acting on behalf of the constitutional order. They were protecting legality through lawlessness. And one of the things that Dan's work does is it highlights how constitutionalism and white authoritarianism in the US are oftentimes two sides of the same coin, that there's a common and persistent language of articulating lawlessness and racial violence as a way of defending an established constitutional order. And that, as was sort of just said earlier, that one of the things that I'm especially sad about is not to have Dan here to articulate the links between the present and precisely the themes that he was describing. Okay, and I'll be very quick about the next two. The next one is immigration law in the US. His arguments about anomalous zones speak directly to the criminalization of immigrant status. It's a powerful way of understanding how you can have an immigration system that seems grounded in process, yet at the same time disappears children. And finally, his work also beautifully shows the psychology of certain kinds of liberal legal actors. How is it that justices on the Supreme Court could think of themselves as liberal, could refer to things like lynching as barbaric, yet at the same time allow the practice to continue? And what Daniel's work highlights is how the focus on liberal legality as the defining frame of what the constitutional order is, what justices generally do, allowed them on the one hand to think of themselves as liberal while at the same time permitting practices that re-entrenched forms of racial violence. It's a wonderful book. The work is incredibly compelling, and I feel grateful and lucky to have been able to learn from it. So thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you so much, Aziz. That was a really fascinating contribution. And yeah, the fact that Daniel isn't here to join in the conversation at the moment is such a loss. I'll turn now to Professor David Plotke from the New School to speak.
Thank you very much, Kim, and it's a pleasure to see all these people, both these faces on the screen, and see all the chat notices from people from all over. It's great. I knew Daniel Kato for well over a decade, first when he was a PhD student in my department, and then during and after the year of his graduation, I kept in touch with him about his work and often about jobs. I recall writing many letters for and about Daniel over the year about jobs. That was one of our connections. I helped advise him when he first entered the academic job market in 2008, 2009, which, as you'll recall, was a very bad year for academic jobs and everything else in the economy. Given that context, he did very well in getting a tenure track position at Kalamazoo College, which is an excellent college with one big problem. Using a California frame where he was from, that I would joke with him, was Kalamazoo more like the Ojai or the Escondido of Southwest Michigan? Probably neither, according to Daniel. I explained to him that when he was deciding what to do, that especially in a recession, joining the academic job market in the US was a little like joining the French Foreign Legion in colonial times. If you were in, you were in, and you didn't get to say, I prefer not to go to Dakar. Later, some of our interaction returned to job market matters as he and I had to navigate the cultural differences between high-end academia in the US and the UK. Figure out how to present himself, figure out how to present him from my side. If you're an American referee writing a letter of reference for an assistant professor in the US, and she has published a couple of pretty good articles about gender and politics and wants to move, you say to her prospective American employer, X is wonderful. She is like hiring Marie Kondo for your office, as her work will make it easy for you to toss out several shelves worth of feminist work that she surpasses. If you're a UK senior scholar writing a letter for a young Eric Hobsbawm, another person shared by the New School and the University of London, you say, Hobsbawm is not half bad as a historian. What he loses in being a little wooden, he more than gains with above average breadth. So we negotiated those differences. He did with my help, and he ended up at a university in a job that made him deeply happy. So that was a very, very good outcome. He was working on a big project in the last few years. I read several versions of it, a book proposal and a draft article, and gave him comments. The article is entitled The Politics Racism Makes. The working title of the book project was Democratizing Illiberalism. And I'll use a couple of minutes to talk about that because actually his views had changed significantly from his book in ways that he had not entirely worked through. And he continued to demonstrate a capacity to get an insight, not worry about whether it was the correct or incorrect insight, and just go after it and see where it came out. His draft book title, Democratizing Illiberalism, makes a provocative claim. On his account, on his new account, American political development has been deeply ironic. Its democratic side has partly meant fighting to preserve white racial supremacy, while its liberal side has often functioned to at least restrain the racism of some of those democratic impulses. Again, in his words, and these are quite different words than the ones that we've been discussing, but they're related, but he keeps on thinking, reformulating. Quote, the tension between the democratic legitimacy of racism and its illiberal nature puts politicians and judges in a bind as to how to proceed. This formulation, I'm sure, will alarm many small d Democrats for whom the main relevant Jackson in the United States is Jesse Jackson rather than Andrew Jackson. In this perfectly conventional view, the civil rights movement and its successors meant the triumphant, if incomplete, expansion of American democracy and freedom. Daniel doesn't reject that altogether, but he is now insisting that democracy also produces a fierce backlash against egalitarian racial politics. The democratic insurgencies of Goldwater, Wallace, and Nixon, and once again with Trump following Obama. Obviously, he's not about to reject the conventional story altogether, in which a more inclusive democracy and expanded freedom go together. Yet his news story is compelling as well. There has been a durable and influential anti-liberal democratic tradition in the United States. It's represented by Andrew Jackson, the later Tom Watson, Huey Long, and George Wallace for most of his career. This vibrant racial and ethnic tradition, which perceives itself and lays claim to being democratic in a way, has also appeared beyond Black-white relations. Thus, repeated and violent mass movements against Chinese immigrants occurred as popular movements in the American West in the late 19th century. I believe that Daniel was deeply affected and to some degree traumatized by the Trump experience. And the challenging concept of a democratic illiberalism may help us come to grips with that administration and its successors. This movement, I believe Professor Rana was posing the puzzle of how come these people think they're constitutionalists. I'd say for Daniel, from the perspective of his more recent work, the notable thing is they think they're Democrats. They think they're the people in the United States. It's given us new political leaders such as the rapidly becoming famous Marjorie Taylor Greene, the newly elected Republican Congresswoman from Georgia, who cheers on her social media pages calls to execute Democratic leaders. Eccentric, dangerous, ferocious, probably a little crazy. She really did get 75% of her district's vote in Georgia. And by all signs, these Georgians knew pretty much what they were getting. Going further now might mean trying, I'm tempted to turn this into a 45-minute talk on the relation between his earlier and later work, which is not the proper turn to take. I do hope that some of this later work by Daniel can appear before long, as it speaks to such important scholarly and political problems. And I would just say, finally, I miss him terribly.
Thank you so much, David. Really fascinating, and fascinating crossovers with, well, a lot of work that people do here at Queen Mary in relation to democracy and populism. So yeah, great stuff. Okay, we'll now move to Professor Eileen Topol, please, for her comments. Thanks, Eileen.
Hello. I would like to thank Kimberly and everyone who made this meeting possible. Talking about then gives me a strange feeling that I don't have the words for to describe. After more than a year now, it still feels surreal. Daniel Kato was by far the most empathetic person I have ever met. When you give him a good news about your own life, you could make his day. When you share your painful experience with him, he could be your shelter. Yes, he was a good listener, but he was also very good at asking the crucial questions that would help you recover or overcome. And he was able to give you the most healing talks. With this immense virtue of empathy, when many of us arrived in New York from different countries, from so many different walks of life, he didn't have any difficulty relating each one of us. He became literally the central pole of our new school community. He was connected to each and every one of us, bringing us together. And sadly today, he is once again united us to honor his life and his memory. Dan had a truly rich life. He had connections with so many different people. His anecdotes from his college years have always amazed me. He always amazed me by the extent of the rich life, the life experience he had. So when I think about him, I would like to think that he lived twice as much as many of us have lived. So he left us so many joyful memories, and he will live in us through those memories. He will be with us forever. In 2019, late summer, I spent 2 weeks in London, and I stayed at Dan's. And in those days, he was working on a paper. We spent a lot of nights talking about this paper. I read a couple of versions of it in those days. Today, I want to talk about that paper manuscript. He started working around the summer of 2019. The last modified date of the version we have is November 15th. The paper does not have a title yet, or don't have a title. He was still trying different ways to make his argument. The opening sentence of this document is, Idaho, Wyoming, and Oklahoma are 3 of the reddest states in the country. A few sentences later, he says, Republican politicians from Wyoming, Idaho, and Oklahoma are solidly Republican and yet have never attained the top position in the party. He notes, it is not a lack of trying. A few senators from these states have tried to vault themselves into the national spotlight. So here, I will take it from here, and I will try to summarize my understanding of his main argument. As I see it, he was trying to open and look inside the black box of the US state with its historical evolution. His explanandum, or dependent variable, was the resilient nature of racism in the US politics, somewhat hardwired in the state institutions. His explanand, or independent variable, was the Senate in this paper. In his more nuanced wording, enduring persistence of senatorial racism across time, place, and policy. I'm not sure if he was ever used this term for his scholarship, but I always thought that Dan was a critical historical institutionalist. He was very much interested in the role and function in this paper of the Senate in the US politics. In other words, he tried to understand how the institutional formation of the Senate shaped the decision-making of agency of senators. His hunch was that the strategic choices of the Republican senators were not random or haphazard. He argued that the Senate was central with regards to the path-dependent characteristics of the US politics at large. This institutional framework is shaping, for him, the decision-making of the senators. Or this institutional framework is yielding, as he says, a new generation of senators. Hence, Daniel called them the new crop of senators. In order to explore both the depth and depravity of institutional racism in the Senate, he developed a new conceptual framework. He adopted an already existing term, dog-whistle politics by Ian Haney Lopez. Then it reinterpreted and extended this concept and finally conceptualized his notion of dog-whistle policy entrepreneurship. He employed this term of the certain Republican Senate members. For him, the dog-whistle entrepreneurs are the policymakers, and in his study, the Senate members, who strive for their own political promotion by innovating policy priorities, by solely addressing a perceived national aspiration. So what he means by dog-whistle senators? For him, I tried to summarize some of the words he wrote about them. They are partisan from the Republican Party. They are secure in their senatorial seat, so they do not feel the urge to relate to the current affairs. They don't even need to relate to their constituency. Dog-whistle policy entrepreneurs are thus less likely to emerge in places where racism is a salient issue. He particularly focused on Wyoming and Idaho. They are driven to enhance their intra-Washington reputation. For that, they made long-term calculations. In these calculations, they consider racism as an extra credit that would potentially bolster their national profile. Dan argues that this strategy actually further embedded racism. Time-wise, he argued, these dog-whistle senators are particularly at work when Democrats are in power. Because when Democrats are in power, the Republican senators feel the liberty to raise particular issues without the burden of crafting policies to address them. When Republicans gain power, then they address the issues full-fledged. He identified two issues. He says 4 in the text, but then probably he was going to identify 2 others, but the paper we have has 2 issues that Republican senators exploited in different historical periods. moving from one dog whistle to the other: welfare and immigration. Each issue has gone through 3 phases. They were first defined as a problem to be revised. Then they became a crisis to be overhauled. And finally, each issue was rendered as the highest priority. Welfare from 1976 to 1980, and immigration issue was dog whistled in 1988, became a threat to the social compact in 1992, and finally became a full-blown crisis in 1996. He argues 1996 was a crucial point for Republicans. It is when they are not only started to take its victory lap regarding welfare reform, but also elevated immigration as the new crisis to focus on. When they exploited the issue enough, they would switch to another issue, what he then called veiled racism. He was working on, the paper continues and gives the details on the Idaho Senator James McClure and Wyoming Senator Alan Simpson. He identified Senator McClure as an example of a dog whistle policy entrepreneur in welfare issues, and the Senator Alan Simpson as the dog whistle policy entrepreneur in immigration. As I said, this was a work in progress, and the arguments were not yet well substantiated yet. Sadly, he didn't have enough time to tie the loose ends of the argument. I thought this paper needed to be sort of presented. He was very eager. He wanted to present this paper through the 2020, and he was sure he was onto something. And he had a strong intuition about the role of the state in the persistence of racism in the US. As for my last words, I'm almost sure that he was the most humble man in the academia. He wrote from his heart. He was a true intellectual searching for the answers to his questions with a childlike curiosity. It's 9 o'clock. Oh, I'm sorry. With his great sense of empathy, intense forms of hate like racism and xenophobia were the biggest puzzles of humanity for him. He had a dream, and I'm sure his readers will continue to uncover the sources and reproductive mechanisms of racism in the US, and will make his dream come true. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. That was incredibly interesting, that new material, but also a wonderful tribute. Thank you. So we'll move on now to Professor Ian Zuckerman from Regis University. Ian.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think just want to say how much it means to me personally to kind of be here among some of the scholars whose work Daniel admired most in the world, and among some of the friends and mentors who Daniel most cherished. So I'm really so grateful for all of you for being here, and I'm especially grateful for Kimberly Hutchings for organizing this event. So in remembering Daniel, the categories that I think went on the banner of this event of scholar and colleague and friend, for me, as for I'm sure many of you, are thoroughly inseparable. So for me, as for I'm sure many people here, even reading Dan's published work, and this event was a wonderful opportunity for me to reread the work for which Dan is best known, to reread his book, Liberalizing Lynching. And it was an interesting experience for me, that it was really the first time I personally had this experience, which is that the book is so saturated in memories of, countless drafts and writing groups, endless graduate school late night conversations, celebrations of personal and career milestones, that the image that I had in reading this book, and the image I have kind of this experience was that of a palimpsest, of a kind of text that had been written over and written over and written over multiple times. That was sort of what it felt like to reread Dan after all of these years. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes during my comments to speak a little bit personally by trying to kind of like peel off a few of these layers of Dan's book and his work, and to talk through a little bit of what felt present for me below the surface in rereading Dan's words. And the first impression I had in rereading Dan was his voice. It's unmistakable. And I use the present tense advisedly here, because I was just struck again by how Dan's physical voice, his locution, his phrasing, even the kind of outsider position in academia that Dan sometimes talked about, despite and throughout all of his achievements and all of his recognition, how richly and vividly present Dan's voice was for me in his writing. And hearing Dan's voice again in his texts kind of brings to mind the first time that I had heard Dan's public voice in a scholarly context. So if you'll kind of indulge me just a short story or two. Dan and I entered the master's program at the New School in politics together, and it took me a while to figure this out in 2002. That was when I first got to know Dan. And I think that first year we took a class together. We were in a seminar that was taught by Andrew Arado. And at the end of the semester, the class organized a conference in which we all, like all of the students, presented our papers for the class, in the form of a mini conference. And so at this time, Dan was still very much in transition, from being a kind of child of Southern California and, a real sort of product of Santa Monica and an LA, labor organizer and masseuse and so many other things, to being a graduate student in New York. And one quick kind of story will illustrate this transition process for Dan. I remember, I remember around this time hanging out outside the graduate faculty of the New School. And, the entrance was like enveloped in a cloud of cigarette smoke, as all of the New School entrances tended to be at that time. And it was one of those like really bitterly cold, blustery, just like wet fall days in New York, where like the wind and the rain just like chill you to the bone. And I remember Dan like complaining bitterly about the cold. And he had got himself some kind of winter parka, but of course he didn't zip it up. So it was like kind of flapping in the wind. And I remember kind of like looking down and looking, as Dan is complaining, at the LA Lakers basketball shorts that he was wearing underneath his parka, and kind of thinking, you have some adjustments still to do. So it was a bit of an adjustment, but around, like, this was right around the time that, Arado's class organized this conference. And Dan presented, I remember, toward the end of the day, there was some kind of sleepiness, maybe just a little bit of lethargy had begun to set in, as sometimes happens in academic events. And I still remember, kind of this really evokes some of the thoughts of Aziz about the kind of singularity of Dan's vision. I still remember really clearly the subject of his presentation, which was that the founders of the United States had empire on their minds. And this was kind of Dan's thesis. But what I really remember was not actually the subject of the paper so much as Dan's presentation style, which was kind of pure LA labor organizer. He just kind of channeled this like rip-roaring charisma, you know, that he almost kind of reached for a bullhorn that wasn't there. And by the end of the talk, I mean, we were all kind of ready to jump up in our seats and storm whatever bulwarks Dan wanted us to storm. And I thought about that memory, you know, when I was rereading Dan's book for this conference. And I'd like to think that there's really something of that spirit that's really still detectable in reading the much more polished and mature prose of Dan's published work. So that's kind of one layer that I wanted to mention. Another layer is, and I'll just say this really quickly because others have spoken really eloquently of this, has to do with the intellectual context in which Dan first formulated such an extraordinarily bold and original framework for thinking about the conjunction of liberalism and illiberalism, thinking about the conjunction of constitutional commitments and sustained political violence. And I think Dan would be the first to really emphasize the New School as a kind of key intellectual space that nourished that eclecticism. And many of you probably know how strongly Dan identified as a product of the New School and actually how proud he was of that identity. And I think that's another layer that he would want to emphasize. And let me just very, very quickly mention a third layer. And that's a kind of an extraordinary intellectual generosity that in my experience is kind of unique. And I think just a quick glance at the acknowledgements of Dan's book really reflects this sensibility. So in like a page and a half of acknowledgements, it turns out, you know, as I reread this, that like there's so many people without whom Dan says his book wouldn't have been written, that it almost seems like a complete miracle that the book was written at all, right? And I think for a lot of people, this would sound like bluster or false modesty. I think for Dan, I know for Dan, this was completely authentic. He meant every word of it. And I think the way he thought about his work reflected the way he lived for others in his life. It reflected the abundant generosity and the kind of boundless enthusiasm and energy, his unrestrained love for bringing people together. And you know, in an email to a group of shocked and grieving friends last November, I wrote that, and this is a quote, Dan's heart was so big and he loved and brought joy to so many. It's as if he had had the last laugh on death by packing several long lives into his unfathomably short one. He leaves a tremendous void in our lives. And that's what I wrote last November. And of course, one of the reasons why today means so much to me is because Dan left so much more than that. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here and commemorate Dan's scholarly achievements and the way they allow us to continue to feel and celebrate his presence. And I want to end with maybe a thought. You know, I began by invoking this image of rereading Dan's work as a kind of palimpsest. You know, and that's almost like a paradigm of this kind of careful, painstaking, solitary individual effort. And I think Dan, whose joy in and gifts for creating community were unmatched, would appreciate the irony. And I'd like to think that he'd have a good hearty laugh at me, maybe, for invoking this metaphor, because it's really kind of like by coming together collectively and seeing so many dear old friends that we can kind of more fully retrace some of the outlines of Daniel Kato's, I think, stunningly brief and astonishingly full and well-lived life. So thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you so much, Ian. Your comments there, particularly around the charisma and the presence, reminded me that he's the only academic I've ever seen when giving a paper who quite literally jumped up and down, taking both feet off the floor. It was quite extraordinary to watch. Okay, next up we have Professor Alex Gourevitch from Brown University. Alex.
Well, first off, thank you, Professor Hutchings, for organizing this. I can't tell you how meaningful it's been to kind of be present with everybody for this, to hear everybody talk about Daniel. and to just be reminded of just how many people he reached. And it's just been so moving to hear everybody talk about so many aspects of Daniel's life. I wanted to second something that a couple of you have said, which is that there was nothing like being supported by Daniel. I mean, that guy knew how to make you feel good about what you were doing like nobody else, more than parents can make you feel. Like, it was just incredible. He was, because it was so genuine, his enthusiasm for stuff. And there were various important moments in my graduate career and afterwards where without his encouragement, I definitely would have felt much less able to keep going. I said that I was going to talk about an unpublished piece of work by Daniel, which was something that he was writing or maybe wanted to co-write with me, which was about the slaughterhouse cases, which were these cases that ended up narrowing the meaning of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Because they bring up kind of other dimensions of how Daniel thought. In truth, what I'd like to do is just spend 10 minutes sharing anecdotes about Daniel, because he had the most anecdote-rich life of anybody I know. But maybe we can do an anecdote happy hour someday about Daniel, because I know we've all got some. But I can't resist just one, because it speaks eventually to what he, about this unpublished work, which is that I first met Daniel, I think my third year of graduate school, maybe 2005. When actually Ian brought him around to my apartment where I was staying in New York. And when we first, because Ian said, oh, he's a cool guy, you like to meet him. And I met him and I thought we had a great time. And I found out immediately afterwards that he didn't like me at all. He didn't think much of me at all. He thought I was just an academic blowhard. And we all know that Daniel had no patience for academic blowhards at all. He was someone absolutely not interested in the puzzles and problems that academics feel they have, or in particular in the kind of what he often called bullshit Kuhnian paradigms that academics come from their own theories. And because, Daniel was a problem-driven guy. He cared about politics. His questions were questions about the things that mattered, not about the BS of academics. Lucky for me, I think Ian talked him around to giving me a second chance. Although I think really the only reason I got a second chance is because I was also from the West Coast. And so there were not very many other people at that time in New York who he could talk to about being a West Coast kid. So we then did become good friends. He even convinced me to fly with him to Chicago in late January and drive to Green Bay, Wisconsin to watch Green Bay play Pittsburgh in the Super Bowl, and convinced me that we needed to make a stop outside Milwaukee to see the Temptations on our way there, which is something I never would have done without Daniel's encouragement and sense of adventure. But most importantly, we ended up in a dissertation writing group. And in that writing group, it turned out that both Daniel and I had become interested in these slaughterhouse cases, which ended up redefining. They were the first cases to deal with the meaning of the amendments that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, that established equal protection under law and national citizenship. And I had gotten interested in them because those cases had, the rulings had basically said, well, poor white workers who wanted to use them to criticize other kinds of subjugation could not appeal to the amendments, and in particular, the abolition of involuntary servitude. And I had mentioned this to Daniel, and he got super interested in it, or he was already reading it because he was in the process of doing the work that would become Liberalizing Lynching. And he discovered this incredible line. I mean, I had read the slaughterhouse cases 3 or 4 times, but he discovered this incredible line in the opinion that I had never noticed, which is, and it's a really pivotal moment in the opinion where the Justice Miller, says that the essential provisions of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were targeted for one purpose and one purpose only, which was to deal with, quote, that race and that emergency. That's the line that he identified in the opinion. And Daniel had spotted that what was going on was an attempt to narrow the meaning of these the 13th through 15th Amendments, and to take them from being public expressions of a new vision of freedom and of an emancipated society that all could appeal to criticize a wide range of forms of subjection. And that instead they were getting redefined to deal with a particular racial emergency. This is, Aziz has actually already brought this up, but he found the actual lines where this justice says, these are only meant to deal with and bring an end to that race and that emergency. And out of this, Daniel came up with this incredible idea, which was he found in that phrase and the idea that the point of these amendments was to end the racial emergency of chattel slavery and the Civil War. What he saw was a whole strategy for trying to constrain and discipline efforts to criticize various forms of oppression that he saw repeated throughout American history. So he had this idea that by analyzing slaughterhouse cases, you could see how in the name of trying to bring to an end a particular form of racial oppression, in fact, the state and in particular the courts actually attempted to roll back and constrain much wider and more substantial attempts to criticize economic subjection by poor whites and poor blacks, or even to come up with a more expansive understanding of what racial justice would mean. And he got super enthusiastic. I was looking through drafts of this last week, and he started writing up. He's like, we should co-write this together. And I thought, well, you've got all the insights. I just, wrote about this one thing about it, but it's all you. And he went through various iterations and wrote up a few drafts. He incorporated some of it, I think, into liberalizing lynching, but had this whole other idea, which was that it wasn't just the case that in the US, there had been the strategy of creating these anomalous legal zones for allowing these like illiberal moments within liberal regimes, but there was also ways in which, in order to contain wider social movements that sought, the emancipation of people from new forms of oppression, the state would announce that it was bringing to the end one of these anomalies or one of these emergencies, because now it would redefine this not as an occasion to think expansively about what equal freedom would mean, but instead turn slavery into just this exception that was now over. And now it would be used to discipline these new social struggles. And I wanted to talk about this also in part because the other funny thing about Daniel that I think really came across in this research is that, how was it that you had this guy who on the one hand had no time for academic blowhards and was deeply politically committed, but then had all this time for reading just the most obscure arcana of German legal theory, or for reading and rereading and finding these little telling phrases in the just dull gray on gray lifeless text of Supreme Court opinions. And I think there were two things about Daniel that I really learned from. I'll just end on this, which is the first is that Daniel was deeply passionate and committed to thinking about the problem of racial oppression, but he didn't think that the problem was obvious or transparent. And so he wasn't against theory at all. He didn't much like academics and academia, but he thought you needed theory to try and understand the complexity of the problems that really mattered. And the second is, I think Daniel came to see in the law in particular, he understood the law as, and in particular, these obscure little legal texts, the deepest expressions of a political community's political values, because these political values determined how the law as an organized form of public coercion was going to be used to protect or not protect, or emancipate and not emancipate different groups of people. And that was why he could read and find these telling little phrases. I've got it in my inbox. And he says, this is this is the quotation, that race and that emergency. I'm like, Daniel, how did you even find that? But because he saw the law in this way, it wasn't just a dull field for judges to write about. It was the mobilization of public coercion to oppress or not oppress, to protect or not protect different groups of people. And so he could just make it come to life in a way that I think very few people could. And it's why he could write not just Liberalizing Lynching, but have all these other amazing ideas that it's our incredibly bad fortune not to have the chance to see fully come to light. And I just want to end by saying I miss him. And sorry. He was an amazing guy.
Thanks, Alex. And absolutely. An amazing person and an amazing intellectual as well. Thank you very, very much for that. That was a really wonderful set of comments. So we'll come finally to Dr. Katherine Hall from Queen Mary, who's going to be the last of our panelists to contribute. Kate.
Thanks, Kim, for organizing this. And this has been amazing. It's like really inspiring. I am probably the not at all the best person from Queen Mary to speak about Daniel on this panel. And I really hope my colleagues chime in the chat or after this. But I really wanted to speak about the experience of, I've been at Queen Mary since 2018, so I've gotten to know Daniel as a colleague, but also in teaching his module this past term. And I will just note before I say what I wanted to say that I think he would like me to strongly call it a class rather than a module. One of the things that really bonded me early on with Daniel was his railings against how the UK system just does everything different and how confusing it is. And so I am going to try my best to stick to class, which is also a module for those of you in the US who do not have the experience of all these terms getting changed over in the UK. In his article on the carceral state 2.0, I think it was in 2017, Daniel looks at the declining numbers of incarceration in the United States, albeit this is still disproportionately large. This is just kind of tipping over the exponential curve. I guess it goes this way. And he makes the argument in this article that this doesn't signal the decline of the American carceral state, but rather its reconstitution or reshaping in new forms. As he argues, the decline in incarceration is countered by an increase in policing and police violence. Again, relatively small disinvestment in prisons, and this also varies very much state to state, is matched with an increased investment in the institutions of policing. So this sort of inverse relationship is really central here to his argument in this article. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. And I've been thinking a lot about this argument in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd and the renewed global attention to Black Lives Matter movement and protests, where once again, this investment in policing has shown the persistent racism and violence of the carceral state. And so it's really interesting. It's been really interesting to revisit these arguments over this past summer. And in the wake of Floyd's death over the summer, I proposed getting Daniel's third year class, American Politics, Carceral State and Social Movements is what it was called, back on the curriculum books for the fall. So this is, I think, in June. And so for this to start in September. It really felt like a class that had to be taught in this moment. It sort of demanded in some ways to be taught. Conversations with students indicated their interest in this, but also I personally felt the need to engage with what was happening for a variety of reasons. And the classroom is one of the places that I know how to do this. Taking over Daniel's module was a really emotionally and intellectually, but emotionally challenging experience. And what I want to do is just share some reflections from this. I felt an immense pressure, which I immediately, upon proposing this, realized I brought on myself and regretted immediately. But I felt an immense pressure to get this right, to get sort of the teaching of this module this term right. And this is for a couple of reasons. This was a module that Daniel created, and going through how he set this up, it's kind of an eerie experience diving into someone else's syllabus and their QM Plus page, or what Moodle is kind of elsewhere. the way he set this up, I think, was heavily influenced by his working up of the article Carceral State 2.0. I don't know the sort of causality there, but you can really see the trajectory of this argument through this module. I imagine maybe it came after or ongoing. I also felt, though, that it had to match the current moment, and that was also a huge challenge for me as well. In setting up and in running the module this last term, it's now significantly different from how Daniel taught it. This isn't because how he taught it wasn't good. I think it last ran in I can't keep track of 2017-18 or 2018-19. So it's not because it wasn't good, it was amazing. And you can go through the slides and imagine exactly how he would teach those slides. But because in part, the way I've reformulated it, it jumps off from where Daniel's ended up when he created the module. And also this is where he ends up in Carceral State 2.0, with, I think, the question of the limits of reform, the ever-evolving nature of the carceral state, and the violence of everyday carcerality, which is a theme that ran through the module this last term, thinking about carceral spaces and carcerality, and the political possibilities in abolition, and what it means to think about the positive politics of abolition. And not positive in the sense of like good or bad, but really in the sense of generative. And I think this speaks a lot to what some other people, maybe not abolition specifically, but this question of kind of the generative nature of a politics of abolition, especially the challenge or the problem here of reform as well. Abolition makes us think not just about how something like the carceral state can be done away with, something so massive, right? Which reform keeps butting its head up against over and over and over again, as Daniel argued. But more importantly, abolition requires us to ask like the fundamental political question, I think, of how can we imagine our world to be different? How can all of this potentially be different? And I think this is such an important question right now. It's one that I find to be a desperate and urgent question. It is one that made this a very difficult, I think, term and to work through. And it is one that can, I think, feel quite hopeless at times. And throughout this term, I have felt, and some of the students from my module are here, have felt quite hopeless, to be like perfectly honest. But a statement from Ruth Wilson Gilmore that has really been echoing in my head throughout this last term, that came from an interview on COVID, incarceration, and abolition that we watched together in the module. She said, and I'm gonna botch it, she said it much more eloquently than this, but she said, paraphrasingly, in order to change everything, we have to change everything. And at first I found this really, I mean, it's one of her beautiful phrases that you just goes in your head and goes in your head. But it's one of the things that when I first heard it, it felt really discouraging and really overwhelming. But when I sort of have been thinking a lot about it, I've found that this statement means that to change everything means that you can start anywhere. And scholarship like Daniel's, with its, as everyone now has noted, hyper attentiveness to the different workings of the carceral state in all of its different places. This is something we reflected on at the Teach Out last year about his book, and just how he could dive so deep into the different aspects of the carceral state and make them come to life for everybody. So scholarship like Daniel's in this way helps us to see the sort of shape-shifting nature of the carceral state. This is true also in Liberalizing Lynching. And this helps us, I think, to this problem, to think, okay, what is the interconnectedness here of this web of the carceral state? And so where are the avenues that we can begin to think about change? But it also means, I think, this idea that in order to change everything, we must change everything, also means that we can start anywhere. And for many of us here, and this is something that has been a big takeaway for me from this term in teaching Daniel's class, is that this means that this can start with our teaching, and to start where we are in this moment. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Kate. And that's a really nice note to end on, and very in the spirit of Daniel, I would say. Thanks to all the panelists for really wonderful contributions. I'd like to give the audience an opportunity to raise any comments or questions they might have, or anything they'd just like to add to the discussion. Sorry, I'm just trying to move the chat around so that I can see what I'm doing. Just want to check. I don't know whether people have got the hand raised function or whether we'll need to use the chat.
Kim, I think there's a question in the Q&A tab.
Oh, right. Okay. So people should use the Q&A to put.
Yeah, I think that would be the easiest way.
Right. Okay. Rather than speaking. Okay. So if anybody would like to comment or add or ask a question of any of the panelists, then please feel free to put a comment in the Q&A. Similarly with, oh, it's been answered. Oh no, got it. Or similarly, if any of the panelists would like to add to or respond to anything that any of the other panelists have said, then that's also possible now. So there was actually a question for David, about the paper that you mentioned when you were talking about Daniel's work, and whether it's in published form. So this, I think, was it the book proposal that you were discussing then? So people are just wondering if it's possible to get hold of that.
I was referring to both a short book proposal, 7 or 8 pages, and a draft article of about 35, 40 pages. And they overlap but are not identical. And I'm trying to, I have had some conversation. I'm certainly willing to share them a little bit. You know, they're both very rough, and I'm intending to have a conversation with Eileen before long, which we, by the virtue of the pandemic and our miserable lives, we haven't had it, which is how do you take work like this and get it into a public forum? You know, somebody on this, consider this like a sort of semi-public venue. If somebody wants a copy of one of these pieces, I think it's fine to send it. It's not, he felt fine about sharing it with a certain number of people and sending it around. But then there's another problem, which is it's too interesting to just remain at that level, and I take it as a task to figure out what to do with Eileen's cooperation.
Oh, well, that.
So just send me an email. I'm not gonna just post this on a site somewhere, but if you're interested in getting it, I'll be happy to send it.
Thank you. Okay, good.
If I'm allowed, I can.
Yeah.
Also to note, thanks to Katherine Butterfield, Daniel's girlfriend, we have the archive of Daniel with all his writing and all of his email has been put together, and we have it. So if anyone is interested in anything, I think there's a commitment to share what Daniel had been thinking, and we will be happy to share. And likewise, if people would like to send that to me or Katherine, that'll be great. We can put it in the archives that we already have, that we've been sort of amassing, and that one day we hope will become sort of the archive of Daniel, of all of the previously non-published work that he has done.
That's great, Carlos. Do you want to put your contact email in the chat so that if anybody either wants to know more or perhaps has records that they could add, that they would know where to get in contact? And I should say that we are planning here at Queen Mary to set up an annual lecture series on themes related to Daniel's work under his name. And it would be really wonderful if some of our future speakers were precisely to be elaborating on some of these issues and themes that we've been talking about today. So I hope that may be another avenue through which Daniel's work will continue to resonate and to grow and to be built on. Okay, any other comments? I'm seeing lots of lovely comments in the chat. And is there anything that any of the panelists would like to add? There's absolutely no obligation to do so, but just in case anybody's got a burning desire to add anything in. Okay, so I think in that case, we probably should call the event to an end. We've been online for more than an hour and a half, which is probably more than is good for everybody. It feels a bit sad to end because it's been so wonderful to hear all these tributes and to really relive and re-engage with Daniel and his work. Like I said, my abiding memory of him is that person who literally jumped up and down with intellectual energy, in excitement at what he was going on to do. And it's brilliant that his work is going to be carried on in a variety of ways, including by many of the people here today. I'll just end then by thanking everybody for tuning in. You're all in different time zones, in different places. Thanks so much to the audience for coming. It's been a really, really enjoyable and rich occasion. So thanks to everybody. Take care, everybody. Keep well and keep remembering Daniel. Good night, everyone.